Before we get started, I'll just do a word of prayer, and then maybe we'll do a quick fellowship time, and then we'll get into this. All right, so bow your heads with me. God, we're so grateful that we can meet together like this, unified in the work of your Son on the cross, but at the same time we can disagree and have an in-house disagreement on issues of how the whole creation played out. So God, right now, as we explore this topic a little more, I pray that that your Holy Spirit would be here, your Spirit of truth would be here with us, God, and that you would give me and everyone here a sense of just humility in all of this. This is such a huge topic that we're not going to get into in just 2 classes or 3 classes. And so give us a spirit of humility. Let arrogance and pride just not be a part of this. I pray all this in your name. Amen. So as promised, I gave you guys some reading, some homework last Wednesday, and I'm sure you all got the books and read them, right? So what I thought I'd do is give you some more reading, some must-have books that you need to have and read. Where should I start? Okay, let's start. If you just want to if you want to know about the intelligent design movement, I'm going to be referring to some of their arguments tonight. There's a book called An Easy to Understand Guide to the Controversy, Intelligent Design Uncensored. You could read this book in 2 days, okay? Or maybe a night if you're Pastor Don. If you're the rest of us, you could read it a month, okay? So this is a really good book. It goes through the arguments, and it's just a real, every high school student should have to read this book, okay? So that's a good one. What else we got here? A couple years ago, I think it was 2009, Signature in the Cell came out. Now, I don't have the jacket on this. It actually looks really cool. But they get kind of destroyed, so I took it off. I read this a couple of times. There's 600 pages or something in this, but it's the kind of book that you don't want to put down, okay? It's called Signature in the Cell. It's probably the best book on DNA and how that all goes together. Stephen Meyer, he's a Cambridge PhD. He's the guy who wrote this book. He's the director of the Discovery Institute, which is an intelligent design think tank. If you want to know about the cell, read this, okay? If you don't want to read that, you just want to watch the movie, there's actually a DVD that's called Unlocking the Mystery of Life. I think it's actually in the Resource Center. And Stephen Meyer is in it. He's interviewed. It's like a 50-minute DVD, but it talks about some of those arguments. Obviously not in that detail, but some of you would rather watch something than read something, so that's for you. Just the other day, well, not the other day, maybe 2013 at some point, this book came out, Darwin's Dead. This actually isn't even my copy. Don't tell Pastor Don, but I stole it from him.
It's not familiar.
Yeah, actually, this is a brand new copy. The one that you lent me, my 2-year-old colored in. So that became my copy, and now this is Cedarview's copy, okay? And this is brand new. So I haven't even opened this. So Darwin's Death, okay? You want to sign this out when it gets in the library there, which I'll kind of drop off. It's all about the Cambrian explosion, as well as looking at, so Signature in the Cell was about the origin of life. This is about just what we've been talking about, evolution, okay? And this, again, is Stephen Meyer. And so if you like the one book, you're going to like this one too. And this is a DVD called Darwin's Dilemma, and it's based on the same premise, the Cambrian explosion, which we'll talk about a little bit. And I don't know if that's in the Resource Center. It might be. If it's not, I might lend you mine. This is, though, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. This is a movie about this whole idea of intelligent design and how a lot of these guys are losing their jobs because they're holding to the design inference, or that there is an intelligent designer. And so I may reference that in the talk here. And I thought this was a decent book. If you've read Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, that's the book where he actually gives arguments for evolution. Well, at the same time, this guy, Jonathan Sarfati, he's a young Earth creationist. He put out a book called The Greatest Hoax on Earth. I mean, this guy's a little bit, he takes jabs, maybe when he shouldn't, but he basically goes through argument for argument all the way down. So if you have the two books open together, you could read one chapter and then read this. That'll give you a balanced view of what's going on there, which is what I did. Okay, so I think that's enough to cover you for this week. Let's get into it, okay? So I thought what we'd do first, as usual, is review. Now, I didn't put together a slide to review just because I didn't have time. So what we'll do is we'll just recap quickly and then get into this. We talked about antibiotic resistance, didn't we?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if this thing's... Here we go. Anytime now. There's a lot going on in that slide. Okay, so the first thing we did, we acknowledged that the majority of scientists, many scientists, believe that evolution is a fact, okay? And we said that growing numbers of Christians are now taking that belief that evolution is a fact and their belief in Christ and that God is the creator, and they've kind of, put those two together, okay? They've married those two together. They call it theistic evolutionists. Now, theistic evolution is not a term that most theistic evolutionists like, and so they come up with other terms like biologos and evolutionary creation and all the rest. But it's basically all the same thing. Second, we looked at the different ways this is done. Okay, I said there's about 3 options, or there's probably more. But the first option we said was that God is the one causing the random mutations. He's the one driving the natural selection. Okay. Now, there may be some guys that hold that view. They just don't come out with it. Okay, they admit that the way Richard Dawkins and others describe the process, that's really what's going on. And so they don't like to say, yeah, God's the one, in the background doing this and doing that. Okay, and so that was the first view. The second view was the fully gifted creation view. Now, I should say this was recorded, and I watched the video. Not because I wanted to watch myself, but just because I wanted to see if I said something stupid. And I said a lot of stupid things. Now, one thing I said that I need to correct is I said that the guy who came up with the fully gifted creation view was named Cornelius Van Til. It's actually Howard Van Til. Okay, and I have to make that distinction because Cornelius Van Til is a presuppositional apologist. He's a Christian through and through. Okay. He has a particular view of apologetics that I have some sympathy for, but I don't necessarily hold that view. Howard Van Til was a Christian and an evolutionist, came up with this view of fully gifted creation, and now, as far as I can tell, is no longer a Christian, okay? And still holds to evolution. And so that's Howard Van Til. I know there's going to be people who watch that video that are huge fans of Cornelius Van Til and they're going to say, what? He's not a Christian? So that's fully gifted creation. God does something at the Big Bang or at the origin of life. And then from there, he's hands off and the whole thing runs its course. And the problem is, and we're going to see it in one of the slides here, that this view does not account for the origin of all this information that shows up in the genome. Okay, there's no natural process along the way that will cause that to come about. And we know it's not there at the very beginning. I mean, there is no genetic information in the Big Bang. Okay? There's no genetics at that point. And so that view doesn't seem to hold up. And then Francis Collins' view that, God's in the shadows doing something, but he's just not very specific. And I want to ask the question, what's he doing? Okay, what is he actually doing? How is this evolution playing out with God guiding it? And he just doesn't say. And I said that he actually creates a gap where most evolutionists, his colleagues, will say there is no gap for God. There is no, evolution does it all on its own. You don't need to throw God in the mix. Because he said that's like throwing the leprechaun in when you boil water. Third, I made comments about the interpreting. We interpret Scripture, but we also interpret nature, okay? And I called one theology, one science, and we need to take those two things together and come to truth, okay? And I brought up some examples in how we do that, and how that's been done. Fourth, we defined evolution. Remember, evolution has many different definitions, okay, many meanings. And some of those are uncontroversial. And so, in many ways, I'm an evolutionist. If it just means natural selection or mutations or change over time, you could call me an evolutionist, but that's not really what Dawkins and all these other guys mean. They mean something very specific, and I quoted like 10 or so different scientists who actually have come out and said, evolution means this. It means that all of life is descended from a common ancestor, and how that comes about is through an unguided, undirected, unplanned, unintelligent, these are the words they use, okay, process. And so that's what they hold to. And so my argument was that if you take that kind of evolution, well, that kind of evolution doesn't comport with a belief that God is guiding and God is planning and God is directing. Those two things don't go together. You can certainly believe in God and evolution, okay? I completely agree that those two things are compatible, those two separate beliefs. But if you want to say God is guiding an unguided process, that's where you have a logical problem, okay? Because that's not possible. And I think that's what these guys want to do. These Christians who say, man, I want to remain reputable with the scientific community, so I'm going to take their belief in evolution and bring it to my belief in God. And when in doing so, what they've done is they've taken two opposite things and brought them together, and that's the contradiction. Okay? If you want to come along and say, well, I'm going to change what you mean by evolution, I'm going to say God's really guiding it, well then, okay, there isn't a contradiction there anymore. But you've changed what the scientists are saying evolution really is. Okay? And so that was my point. And if you didn't like my logical argument, well, that's fine, because then we went into the science. So the whole question here is, should Christians embrace evolution? I said, logically, for me, they're just not compatible, if you really understand what evolution is. But scientifically, should we embrace the science? And so I started by looking at what natural selection is. Remember, we put the dogs up on the screen, and you select, nature selected for the long hair, but we lost information in the process. And then from there, we looked at Darwin's finches, or the peppered moths. I forget which one came first. But both of those are textbook examples of evolution in action. But what really is going on there isn't what's going to take you from molecules to man, okay? That's not what's going to get you there. What you need to keep in mind is that if you're going to get there, you need to have an increase in genetic information. Okay, new genetic information is how you get there. But what we notice is when we study these examples, we're going to see that we're actually reducing the information. We're breaking things. Evolution is getting rid of things. Okay, it's selecting things out. It's not creating things. Okay, what we need is a mechanism that creates. Okay, and I'll make the argument the only thing that creates is what we'll see is God in mind. Okay, and so that's where we're at. So I want to keep going here with some scientific arguments that are in the textbooks. I mean, I taught this in grade 11, okay? And then I'll critique some of these arguments as well. So let's turn to the science of embryology. You're thinking, embryology, what does that have to do with evolution? Actually, it has a whole lot to do with evolution. In The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote this. It seems to me the leading facts in embryology, which are second to none in importance, like this was huge for Darwin, are explained on the principle of variation in the many descendants from some one ancient progenitor. And so we have the next quote says, the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar originally, but become, when fully developed, widely similar. So what he's talking about is this. This is in almost every textbook. I took this out of the textbook I used, the Nelson textbook. You have these embryos. Okay, this is an icon of evolution. You see the top embryos here? This right here, you have your fish, you have your salamander, your tortoise, your chicken, and your human. And look at how similar they are. But as they start to develop, you'll notice they get widely different. What Ernst Haeckel, he was a German biologist, he said that what's happening here is these embryos are, the word he used was recapitulating the evolutionary story. He called it ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What does that mean? Ontology is the development of the embryo. Ontology recapitulates, goes through phylogeny, which is the evolutionary history. So the embryo is going through our evolutionary history. Hey, check this out. There's the gill slits. That's the fish stage. Hey, can I tell you two things about the gill slits? They're not gills, and they're not slits. So you never had gill slits. First of all, these right here are folds. They're not slits. They're folds in the skin. You can actually see how the embryo is actually curved over, right? And so you guys can all do this and make folds too. I can. I'm a pretty skinny guy, but you can make folds like that. Second of all, these things have nothing to do with respiration. The scientists who know something about this say that actually what's formed here is like the inner ear. There's some different things going on there, nothing to do with respiration. So they're not gills, they're not slits. Oh, there's the tail. Remember we used to swing with that in the trees? Listen, the embryo has to end somewhere, right? And there's a head on one end. And so, you know, if you've ever taken a rope and you try to get rid of one of the ends by cutting the middle, you still got two ends, right? You can't get rid of those ends. And so here we go, we got the end. That tail, which we're going to talk about later, it actually ends way up here on your back, okay? And so that's the end of the vertebrae there. And so here we got these things. Darwin said this. He considered the evidence of embryology by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory. Okay, that was a letter he wrote to his friend Asa Gray. This was way back in 1860. Now Darwin was not an embryologist, so he trusted Ernst Haeckel in reconstructing these diagrams. So those are what's in the textbook. Here's what Ernst Haeckel actually drew. You recognize these right here? And here's what they actually look like. Turns out this was like one of the biggest frauds in science that I know of. Here's your fish embryo. This is your salamander embryo, tortoise, chicken, and human. These are actual photographs, and those are what he drew. In fact, Science, okay? The journal Science came out, this is 97, so this is not that long ago, okay? Ernst Haeckel's drawing, it says, it looks like it's turned out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. Remember, this is the strongest evidence that Darwin said convinced him of his own theory. Okay? And so I think this is very telling. This shouldn't even be in the textbooks. Okay? I was watching one video online. There's what's her name? Eugenie Scott. Now she's part of the National, I'll get this wrong, but it's like the National Institute of Sciences or something. They have this big name. It's this organization that promotes teaching of evolution. And I know that's not the title, but she actually says the reason they still use these pictures is because there's no copyright on them. They're so old that there's no copyright. And they give the impression of evolution, and that's what we want the kids to know. Okay? The problem is, it's not a good argument. Okay? It's been shown to be fraudulent. The other thing is, the embryos, these are supposed to be the earliest stages, and as they go, they get more different. Turns out this isn't the earliest stage. Embryos actually go back even further into the first cells, and it turns out when you go back even further, they get even more diverse. So think of an hourglass, they're more diverse. That's actually when they're most similar. They call this like the middle stage, and then they get widely different. Okay? So this is actually selected, hey, they look the most similar here. Let's use that as evidence. Okay? So this has got to go from the textbooks. And I get pretty excited about that kind of thing when you got to teach it to the students. So I taught all of this to them. Richard Lenski, I got to tell you about this. This is not in the textbook, but when I heard this argument, I thought, man, if there's anything that's going to convince me of evolution, it's going to be this. Okay? So I thought I'd throw it in here. Richard Lenski, he's a University of Michigan biologist. What he's been doing is he's been running these evolutionary experiments. He started back in February 24th, 1988. He had 12 cultures of E. coli bacteria, okay? They were identical cultures. And what he's been doing and he's still going on today, 1988, he's been growing these bacteria and seeing if he can see any evolution, any genetic change, okay? And so the headline came out. I read in a paper, I think I was working Parks and Rec at the time. We would always debate this stuff. And it said, let me go back to this. It said, okay, that's not going to stay, that there was evidence for evolution from these bacteria. They now have the ability to metabolize citrate. Now, what does that mean? I didn't have any clue what that meant. They've evolved the ability to metabolize citrate. So I thought, let me look into this. Then I looked into it, and now I'm going to explain it to you. So these E. coli bacteria, you gotta stay with me on this. This is cool. These E. coli bacteria in anaerobic conditions, that just means no oxygen. When E. coli bacteria are in no oxygen environment, they will metabolize citrate. Now what they have is this is our little transporter. It comes out and it actually grabs the citrate and pulls it into the cell. Okay? That's what you gotta know. Now, it turns out in aerobic conditions, that is when you're in oxygen, so this is no oxygen, this is in oxygen. When you're in oxygen, it will not metabolize citrate, but it has the ability to. The reason it doesn't is because the transporter isn't expressed. And though there really isn't something that comes out and gets it, but it just won't allow it to come through the cell wall. There's no transporter there. So if you can't transport it, well, there's no point in metabolizing it, okay? So what they found was that if something breaks, if the transporter, if it breaks so that it's on all the time, in oxygen, not in oxygen, well then it turns out it will pull the citrate in and then metabolize it. So this is supposed to be an example of how it evolved the ability to metabolize citrate. Now this may be like over your head right now. So I started thinking about this. And where can I apply this in like real life? And I saw my night light. Check this out. So if we're getting no oxygen, think no light. In no light conditions, does your night light come on or off? When the lights are off, the night light comes on. Okay, so in the absence of light, your night light comes on. Now what happens if you're in a light condition where you have the lights on? Does your light come on? No, it stays off. Imagine something broke in your night light so it always came on. It didn't matter if it was light or dark. Well then you'd have a broken night light, but it would always be on. That's like our mutation. It turns out E. coli bacteria can metabolize citrate no matter what, but they usually only do it when they're not in oxygen. As soon as they're in oxygen, they just don't do it. But something broke inside the E. coli, so now it's on all the time, just like our night light broke, and now it's on all the time. Okay? So really what happened was we broke something that now is expressed all the time, and we didn't actually gain anything new. Now, I was giving this talk at Redeemer University. They had a theistic evolutionist speak, and they invited me to speak. And we were supposed to dialogue. He never showed up for my talk, which was sad. But where was I going with this? But and so there were some people. They advertised the event, and some guys from McMaster, like the Skeptic Society, they came. And so, the rational thinkers, those free thinkers, some guys were sitting front row, and the one guy said, you know what, you left out a whole bunch of stuff about this experiment. I said, like what? And he said, well, like the bacteria got bigger. I said, oh, okay. Okay, everyone, the bacteria got bigger. So I'm telling you this. It turns out they literally put the bacteria in their food. Okay, so you kind of expect the bacteria to get a little bit bigger. That was supposed to be one of those big, like, this is evolution in action. They said also they lost their tails. Their flagella, it's a little tail that goes. Yeah, of course they lost their tail. They didn't need it. They're sitting in their food. They don't have to really compete at all. And so now I'm telling you, this is supposed to be evolution, plus they got bigger, plus they lost their tail. It turns out, remember, they did this experiment from 88, and I forget what I said, till 2010. In that course of time, that's equivalent to, bacteria, they reproduce like crazy. That's equivalent to 1 million years worth of evolution, okay? Taking, like human evolution, taking our generation time to be about 20 years, okay? It's about 1 million years worth of evolution that we've actually studied in the laboratory. This isn't computer modeling. They build these computer models and they try and figure things out. This is the real deal. Like, we're really studying evolution in action. And that's the best they can come up with. Remember, keep in mind, if you want to go from a paramecium to people, you got to add information, like books worth of information. I tried to find the quote. Richard Dawkins says, like, a human cell has like 4,500 page books worth of information. Okay, everybody recognizes the information there. Okay, and so you got to keep. And so if you're going to go from paramecium to people, you're not going to do it the way Richard Lenski's experiments show me. Okay, which is just breaking things. The Cambrian explosion is one of these huge arguments that I think is on side with creationists or intelligent design proponents. What the Cambrian explosion is that there's these two rock layers. There's the pre-Cambrian, that's before the Cambrian rock layer, and then the Cambrian rock layer. And what they find is, in the Cambrian rock layer, there's all of these animal phyla. What that just means is all these animals with different body plans. Something like 40 different body plans they find in this rock layer. And you'd expect to find all of this tree of life, right? The pre-Cambrian, all of these fossils, slow and gradual, evolving into everything we see in the Cambrian rock layer. But what we find is, there is no transitional forms there. Okay? And it turns out, what we do find, because actually at that talks, this one guy said, well, maybe the pre-Cambrian rock layers aren't good for preserving fossils, right? So we find the fossils in the Cambrian, but not in the pre-Cambrian. That's not a good argument, because we've actually found fossilized sponge embryos, an embryo, inside the pre-Cambrian rock layer. So if you can fossilize an embryo, well, certainly it's going to fossilize, something that has a skeleton, okay, not just soft tissue. And so now, before anyone gets worked up about the 530 million years ago to 540 million years ago, listen, if you don't agree with those dates, that's fine. What this shows is, this is what the evolutionist holds to. So what you're doing is, you're climbing into their worldview or their belief system, and you're saying, okay, you believe that between 540 million years ago and 530 million years ago, so in that 10 million year period, there was basically an explosion of animal body plans in the fossil record. And yet we find no intermediates. What saved you? That's what you're doing, okay? Even if you don't hold to the belief in the millions of years, okay? It turns out we actually have less animal body plans alive today than we did then, okay? Which is interesting. There was no humans there, but there was invertebrates, and all these other body plans. Today we actually have less because these animals have gone extinct. So very interesting. In fact, Richard Dawkins, in The Blind Watchmaker, says, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. That's Dawkins. Now, to be fair, if you kept reading on that page, he actually says, and creationists are going to quote mine me. They're going to quote me as saying this. Of course, he believes that it all happens slow and gradual, and that the data's not there. Maybe we'll find it eventually. Okay, but it's true. It looks as though they've just been planted there. So the Cambrian explosion. Some would call it biology's Big Bang. It's like, boom, all you see is these animals in the fossil record. Where did they come from? It turns out stasis, the fact that animals seem to be staying the same in the fossil record and not changing, seems to argue against this whole idea of evolution. For example, the coelacanth. 400 million years in the fossil record, that's a picture of, the fossil of it, and there's one alive today. And there's essentially no change to it, okay, in 400 million years. In fact, they go extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs, according to the whole scheme, okay? Literally, they're gone, and we used to think that that was like a dinosaur. In fact, they call it a living fossil, okay, because it's like actually finding a dinosaur. They literally disappeared 65 million years ago, and then, in 1938 they found one swimming, and they're like, hey, these things are still alive. That was kind of cool. You got like the horseshoe crab going back 445 million years, essentially the same. The lamprey going back 360 million years, essentially the same. In fact, you can read the literature. These are creationists making these arguments, by the way. You can go through and just says, man, these things are identical. You find these sea turtles, you find all these different creatures, and they seem to be identical. In fact, I would argue that when you search the fossil record, you find creatures that actually stay the same. You find more stasis than you find anything evolving into something else, okay? It seems to be just preserving creatures that we already know about. In fact, if you go back to Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, 1859, he wrote this: the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. I mean, think about it. Think about all the creatures that we have alive today, and then for intermediates, I mean, between two creatures, you're going to have all these intermediates. You'd think that the fossil record would just be full of billions of these things. He asked, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection that can be urged against my theory. Charles Darwin was much more open to criticism to Darwinism than any Darwinist alive today, okay? Dawkins would never make a statement like this, okay? Darwin was fully open to having his theory tested, which I think should be admired. PhD from Harvard, David Rupp, he's a University of Chicago paleontologist. Back in 79, I think it was, he wrote, well, we are now 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we did in Darwin's time. Because some of the fossil transitional forms in Darwin's time actually turned out to be hoaxes. It turned out to be not really transitional forms. Okay? And so he says we have fewer. And he's not a creationist either. Here's another guy, another Harvard paleontologist. You have Stephen Jay Gould. He said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbook have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. In fact, it's so funny, when you read like a paleontologist, someone who studies the fossil record, they'll usually, if they're going to argue evolution, they'll argue like genetics. And then the guy who's a geneticist, he'll use the fossil record. Because they seem to know their own discipline enough to know that the evidence seems not to be there. Okay, and I'm going to go through some of the fossils that are often used. So let's look at whale evolution. Whale evolution is pretty much in every textbook. You start with this creature, Pakicetus. Okay? Now, Pakicetus is supposed to be around 50 million years old. Now, it turns out when they first discovered Pakicetus, they just had a few bones here from the skull, and this is the picture they actually came up with. They thought this guy was swimming around eating a fish. Turns out when we put a few more fossils together, the fragments, you end up coming up with something like this, like a dog, okay, or a pig or something like that, okay? So we're going to go from Pakicetus to essentially the first aquatic animal, which is Basilosaurus. Basilosaurus is at about 40 million years. Okay, so you got about 10 million years to get from essentially a dog to a whale. Okay? And there's quite a number of things you have to do to get there. You guys know the difference between the two, right? Okay, so some of the creatures we found, Ambliocetus. Ambliocetus goes back to 49 million years, so right near Pakicetus actually. Remingtonocetus, that's right around the 47 million year, 49 million years. And then you have Rhodocetus, okay? All essentially at that end, that's 47 million years. Here's the problem. I could go through and talk about how those three transitional forms don't seem to add up, okay? In fact, remember, the artist impression, the artist diagram you see they're importing a lot of creativity, okay? As we saw with when Pakicetus first came out. What they've actually discovered, the problem is really much worse. They actually discovered a fully aquatic jaw around the 49 million year mark. So those transitions that come after that aren't really transitional forms. The transition has to go in between, doesn't it? And so you got to go from Pakicetus to a fully aquatic whale in just a few million years. And remember, when we looked at Richard Lenski's experiment, in a million years worth of evolution. And bacteria, they mutate actually a lot better for the evolutionists than something like a whale. That's 1 million years worth of evolution. They say in probably less than 5 million years, you've got to go from Pakicetus to a whale. So there's lots of things that have to go. You got to, blubber for temperature insulation, the tail fluke and all the muscles that go with the tail, the reduction of the hind limbs, the forelimbs have to be transformed into flippers. They have to be able to nurture young underwater. You have to change the kidneys, change the lungs, move the nasal passage from here to here. And you don't just take a drill and there's a little more to it than that. You got to modify the teeth, modify the eyes for underwater vision. You got to reorganize the skull bone, modify the ears. I mean, there's just so many different things that have to be done for this to happen. And it just doesn't seem like evolution can do it, okay? At least from what we know from the experiments. Tetrapod evolution is another big one. Tetrapod evolution is going from a fish to a tetrapod, something that walks on all fours. Okay? So remember, how evolution works is you basically evolve out of the water, fish, and you walk up onto land, and then some of the creatures that are on land stay on land, and some of them, like Pakicetus, head back towards the water. Okay? See how that works? And so now we're not going 50 million years ago, we're going way back to 400 million years ago. And so we have Pandarithnes 380 million years ago. You have Eusthenopteron, which you guys try and say some of these names, 385 million years ago. And you got to go to something like Ichthyostega, which is at 365 million years ago, and Acanthostega, which is around the same time, okay? So here we have we have fish, and then we got some things that look like they probably walk on land, okay? And lo and behold, you creationists, you want intermediates? Here it is. I I've seen this in debate, okay? Oh, Ken Miller, you want to see it? Here it is, and he holds up his sign, and it says Tiktaalik, right in the middle, 375 million years ago, right in the middle of time, looks like it fits just perfect. This is the guy that's walking out. This is the transitional form, okay? So that is in the textbooks right now, although, as of 2010, it should be out of the textbooks. Let me explain why. Again, I'm not critiquing Tiktaalik. I could do that, but it turns out new evidence out of Poland, going back all the way to essentially 400 million years ago, older than those fish, we have tracks. We've discovered tracks that are tetrapod tracks. Literally, fingers and toes, feet, big feet, by the way. They actually thought they were dinosaur tracks for a little while, but now they think, these guys, these are tracks. Now, they don't have the guy that made the tracks, but we have the tracks. So now the evolutionists are saying, Tiktaalik, literally have to reorganize the entire tetrapod tree, because Tiktaalik can't be a transitional form when you actually have the tetrapod before, okay? It only works as a transition if it's in between. So, you guys get my point? Yeah. And so this whole tree, in fact, I was on the Why Evolution is True website, and I pulled this diagram. In the article, they said this whole tree has to be redone, okay? Because of this new discovery. And actually, some people were saying, this is great for science. See, we're not committed to dogma. We're able to change our theory. Well, they're able to change how it got there. I mean, they're now searching for new transitional forms. They don't change the belief in evolution. They're just changing how it was done, right? And so, okay, that's not going to work. So, let's talk about homology. Just looking at the clock. Let me explain. I won't go through some of these quotes. Maybe I'll just read this one. So Dawkins, in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, he says the human hand, the backhand, are obviously, no sane person could deny it. He likes to throw in those quips. No sane person could deny it. Two versions of the same thing. The technical term for this kind of sameness is called homology. A bat's flying wing and our grasping hand are homologous. And so, this is the textbook picture you're going to see here. You have all these patterns. You have the human hand and arm. You have the cat, or sometimes they'll show a horse leg, the whale flipper, the bat hand, wing, and they'll put all these together and say, look, it's same basic structure, different function. That's homology. Now the problem is, to use this as an argument for evolution, they actually define it as evidence for evolution. So it becomes a circular argument. Here's what, in Icons of Evolution, Jonathan Ball says, it turns out that using homology as evidence for evolution is logically fallacious. He says more specifically it's circular reasoning. This is called begging the question. They'll say that the structures are similar because it's due to a common ancestor. Okay? It's due to common descent. That's why it's similar. And yet, you can't define it that way and then say it's evidence for evolution. That's circular reasoning, just like this. If I said, how do you know the Bible's the Word of God? You say, because it says so. And then I say, how do you know what it says is true? And you say, because it's the Word of God. Well, how do you know it's the Word of God? Because it says so. Like, it's just a circular argument, okay? If I said, how do you know evolution is true? Because it's a fact. And I said, how do you know it's a fact? Because it's true. That's a circular argument. Okay, you got to import some evidence in there. Likewise, here's the argument they're using. How do you know the structure is homologous? Well, it's because it's inherited from a common ancestor. That's how they know it's homologous. The bat wing, the whale flipper, the human hand. They say those are homologous because they're from a common ancestor. How do you know it's from a common ancestor? Well, because it's homologous, that's why. It becomes a circular argument, okay? And so, here's the real question. I mean, okay, there's homology, a whale and a bat, okay? The problem is, there's this thing called analogy, or sometimes called convergent evolution, where similar structures show up that have the same function, but no one thinks that they have a common ancestor, or a close common ancestor. So an octopus eye and a mouse eye. They argue that those evolved completely separate. So literally, an eyeball has evolved completely independent at 2 different times. Things like the whole marsupial and placental mammals. So these two wolves you see on the screen, you got like your timber wolf and then you got your marsupial wolf. These two, you may not be able to tell the difference between them. They argue that these evolved separately through convergent evolution because of their environment or whatever. It turns out they're not even in the same environment. It turns out, you can actually see the list here. There's actually a marsupial pair with a placental mammal all the way down. So you can look at, the flying squirrel or the mouse or the anteater, all those different things. And they argue that those evolved completely separate from each other. Not from each other, but completely separate. In fact, that wolf you're looking at is more closely related to a kangaroo than any wolf that we have, okay? And so, and yet, when you look at those two things, those two wolves, essentially, they'll say, well, how do you know those aren't related? Well, they argue, well, that one was evolved way in Australia, and these guys were over in North America, there's no way they could evolve from each other. And so they argue in that fashion instead of homology, but it seems to really beg the question. And then you have like echolocation. Echolocation evolved, they have to argue actually separately with the bat and the dolphin. And it just seems like that for that to happen once would be awesome. And they have it happening at least twice. Vestigial organs. So your coccyx, your tailbone, a little bone back here, they'll say that's a vestige, a no longer functional, it was from your tail. So if you look at a dog, they use their coccyx to essentially wag their tail. We don't use ours for that purpose. They'll say it has no purpose. Listen, that bone, the coccyx, actually has more muscles connected to it than any other bone in your body. Okay? In fact, if you want to test this out, I'm not going to do it, just jump on your coccyx. Just jump, just climb to that chair and see how badly that hurts. That bone is doing a lot more than we probably even know. The appendix was argued for a long time, that's vestigial. It turns out it has some function actually in your immune system, okay? Goosebumps, I mean, we could just go on. There's been a whole list of things that see vestigial organs, that's evidence for evolution. The salamander, these cave-dwelling creatures have lost their ability to see. Okay, so there's a salamander and a fish. That's what I want to talk about here. Because Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, he says these troglobite, that's what they call these cave-dwelling creatures, include some salamanders, fish, shrimp, crayfish, millipedes, spiders, crickets, and many other animals. They are often white, having lost all pigment and blind. They usually, however, retain vestiges of eyes, and that this is the point of mentioning them here. It says vestigial eyes are evidence for evolution. Given that a cave salamander living in perpetual darkness so has no use for eyes, why would a divine creator nonetheless furnish it with dummy eyes, clearly related to eyes, but non-functional? That's the question. Why would God, you creationists, why would God put these eyes that have no function into a fish or a salamander? Why would God create, a person with an appendix that seems to have no function? That's kind of how the argument goes. And so how do we respond to the challenge? Just because something was functional, we all agree they were functional, and becomes vestigial, that is non-functional, doesn't mean it wasn't designed in the first place. So just because this salamander lost its eyes, doesn't mean it wasn't designed in the first place. So just think, I mean, obviously, there's a car, okay? The car on top seems to be functional, seems to be drivable, probably the air conditioner works. Over time, stuff happens, maybe you get in an accident or whatever, things stop working. So maybe the AC in your old car doesn't work anymore. Are we now able to say that because it's no longer working or non-functional, it was never designed in the first place? No, that's a terrible argument. And so vestigial structure arguments for evolution seem to really accomplish nothing. All they really accomplish is that something was lost, a function was lost, de-evolution at best, okay? De-evolution at best, something that's being lost. So what I want to do, I don't have my audio set up. Okay, I won't even bother showing you this video. It's Francis Collins. I watched this last night, so I thought I'd show it to you. But let me just explain, because he puts a very similar slide up. It's less colorful as mine, but he puts the same slide up in his talk. He says, hey, look at these genes. Not only do we have vestigial structures out there, there's actually vestigial genes. Genes that no longer work. They're called pseudogenes, okay? And so these pseudogenes, here we have EPHX2. Behind here, this is GULO or GULO, and then we have CLU. These are all genes. It turns out the human, the ape, the cow, the mouse, all these mammals have the same genes in the same order. And he says, well, same genes in the same order. Why would they have that? Probably because of evolution, right? But he says that's not even the most powerful argument. The most powerful argument is when you look at apes and you look at human beings, they actually have the same pseudogene. They actually have the same gene that's broken. What are the chances that these two, apes and human beings, have the same gene that's broken and aren't related? What are the chances? Why would God, he makes this argument. You gotta go watch the lecture. It's a Veritas YouTube video. It's like 2 hours long. And he gives a full case for theistic evolution. And this is one of the best arguments he gives, I think. So why would God put that in there? Is God deceiving us? That's what he asked. Would God deceive us with this? And so I started thinking, but I started researching a little bit more about it. It turns out, so you got the human, the ape, and the cow. It turns out the guinea pig has the same pseudogene in the same location. So on his argument, on Francis Collins' argument, we must be closely related to a guinea pig. But he doesn't believe that. What they argue is, what scientists argue is, this happened completely independent. That gene broke completely separate of human beings. Just so happens human beings have the pseudogene, it broke. The GULO, by the way, is what synthesizes vitamin C. Okay? And so the reason, and he makes this point, I thought it was clever, the reason the sailors on the ships got scurvy and the mice didn't is because the mice can make their own vitamin C. Human beings can't. Okay? And so it turns out guinea pigs can't either. But it turns out, so if that happened independently, why couldn't we say that apes also have this pseudogene that happened independent as well? You get what I'm saying? Why can we conclude that we're related to apes, but yet the guinea pig broke the gene completely separate and we're not related to that? You see, you can't have it both ways. So that's pseudogene. I won't show this video either. DNA, this is kind of the mantra in genetics. DNA makes RNA, which makes proteins, and the proteins make you. And so, we'll see. Okay, check this out. I mentioned junk DNA, and someone came up to me and said, you didn't, we have junk in our DNA, what's that doing there? Richard Dawkins says this in A Devil's Chaplain. He says, genomes are littered with non-functional pseudogenes, okay? Faulty duplicates of functional genes that do nothing. While they're functional cousins, the word doesn't even need scare quotes, because he really thinks they're cousins. get on with their business in different parts of the same genome. Once again, creationists might spend some earnest time speculating on why the creator should bother to litter genomes with untranslated pseudogenes and junk tandem repeat DNA. What's he talking about? Our DNA, 98% of it, it's been argued. Well, 98% is non-functional. It doesn't code for proteins. Remember, DNA codes for RNA, which makes proteins, which makes you. Turns out only 2 to maybe 5% codes for proteins, which makes you. Okay? The other 95 to 98, depends who you read, say that's junk. It doesn't code for proteins. It's just this evolutionary baggage that we've accumulated over time. Now this guy, oh my goodness, I'll just read this. I don't know why these things are blowing apart. Richard Sternberg, he's got 2 earned PhDs, one's in evolutionary biology. He wrote, one day, we will think of what used to be called junk DNA as a critical component of truly expert cellular control regimes. So what he says is, and please don't blow apart. Oh my goodness. I gotta show you this. Alright, so no more junk. It turns out, so the Human Genome Project, it mapped the human genome. After that, they set up what's called the ENCODE Project. It stands for the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, okay, project. That's the ENCODE Project. And it has systematically mapped regions of transcription, you know the junk part? So the regions of transcription, transcription factor association, chromatin structure, histone modification. You don't have to know what that means. All you gotta know is this. These data enable us to assign biochemical functions for 80% of the genome. Now, not code for protein function. What they're finding is these things like turn things on. So say you're growing in the womb, and your arms are growing, and something's being turned on, expressed, hey, grow, 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 and then it says, turn it off, stop. We don't want that anymore. Now we're going to grow some. So these like switches, like I can think of light switches. Okay, that's 98% of the genome, which I thought was junk. Turns out it's like software code that's like working behind the scenes. Okay, and so this idea of junk, which is still in the textbook, junk DNA, is junk. Okay, it's going to be gone. In 20 years from now, no one's going to talk about junk DNA. It's going to actually be kind of an embarrassing, footnote in the history of science. You know what? I told myself that I'd stop at 8 o'clock and ask for questions. Because I'll just keep going forever. My plan was to power through this stuff so that next week I could do something completely different. But let's just see how the questions go. And if there isn't any, I'll keep going. But does anyone have any questions before I give a positive argument for design? Yeah.
Okay, so back to the
yeah. Argument
against God influencing evolution. I thought about that for a bit, and how about a counter argument? Would this be a counter argument?
Sure.
Okay, a lady is getting mugged across the street. You don't do anything. You don't run over to help her.
Yeah.
That's a sin of remission, would you say?
I would say yeah.
Okay, God allows evil to get good things done. Would that not be a sin? But God does not sin. So, I guess what I'm getting to is, God is the God that makes the rules, so somehow could he not at another level, like regardless of what you think is a logical argument,
yeah,
offering a side.
So I think to defeat the logical argument, what you have to do is show that the process of evolution is guided. And I have no, if it is guided, then the logical argument completely breaks down. The only argument I'm making is that the scientists are saying it's unguided. And so if you're trying to, and I think this is partly the motivation, I think it's the majority motivation, is to have that respectability with the scientific community. Christians want that respectability, and so let's say, if you say you're a young earth creationist in the scientific community, you're laughed out of there, okay? And most people won't take you seriously. And so a lot of people will say, okay, they'll maybe keep their views to themselves. In fact, I went to lunch with a guy who works with one of the top apologists in the world. And I won't say who he is, but he's a young earth creationist. But no one knows that. I mean, the guy speaks at the top universities in the world. But he keeps that to himself. And I think partly because he doesn't want to talk about that subject. He has bigger things to talk about. But partly to remain respectable among his colleagues. And so if we're going to marry the idea of evolution to creation, we have to take it as it is. And so my argument was, as is unguided. So I completely agree with, as soon as you start to, I think you got a good point. But the only difference is, I'm thinking of unguided and guided. As soon as you change those words, obviously the contradiction breaks down. So God could certainly be behind the scenes. And if evolution is true, like Francis Collins says, he is working behind the scenes. Okay, there's no real evidence for that, but sure, if evolution truly is true, then that must be how it's being done. I mean, and so I guess that's a possibility. I don't think it's probable, but it is possible. It's not logically impossible. But then God is really guiding it, right? So the argument, the logical argument, and the more I've been thinking about it too, it hinges on the fact of how the scientists define evolution. As soon as you say God's behind the scenes guiding it, well then all of a sudden there is no logical incompatibility. And Christian could accept it. I mean, I can argue theologically against it. All I've shown is that the science doesn't seem to add up. But from a logical perspective, sure, you could say God used evolution that way. Any other questions? It's a tough one. Yeah.
So how does the younger creation theory coincide with the scientific evolution theory, where there certainly seems to be evidence that there's dinosaur fossils in some form of prehistoric life, which would contradict evolution? Sure. So where does those two tie together?
Yeah, so a young earth creationist doesn't deny the fossil record. I mean, I was a pretty staunch young earth creationist in teachers college. We went to the ROM, okay? All the teachers, or future teachers, I should say. And so I'm standing next to this guy, and he was a pretty hardcore evolutionist. In fact, he saw Lucy. He saw the actual Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, which is like supposed to be one of the fossil hominids, right? He saw it. He stood up at the beginning of our semester in front of everyone and said that changed his life, seeing this ancestor of us. And so he turns to me and says, "What are you going to do with all these fossils? Do you just ignore all of them?" Of course not. We all have the same fossils. The young earth creationist believes that the reason we have the fossils is because there was a global flood that buried a lot of animals. I mean, how do you fossilize a T-Rex? I mean, everybody's got this problem. You don't just take your cat, throw him on the front lawn, and expect them to fossilize. That's not how you get a fossil, right? If you want to fossilize something, let's say you have a fish at home. Take a bag of cement and just dump it in your fish tank. That's how you fossilize your fish, okay? Because you have to bury it quickly, away from decomposition and everything else, away from scavengers carrying the bones away, all of those things. You've got to essentially encase the thing. And then the bones, literally, the sediment exchanges with the bone, and then you get this, this fossil. And so the young earth creationists who hold to that global flood, and there's at least the scientific community recognizes these fossil graveyards that have land animals and birds and aquatic animals all together mashed up, and they were buried in a flood. Now they wouldn't say it was a global flood, but they would say in that local area there was something, this catastrophe that happened, and that's how you got your fossil. And so the the young earth creationist interprets things in light of their beliefs. And so they interpret all the fossil record in terms of global catastrophe. Whereas the old earth creationist, or the evolutionist, or whoever you're talking to, says those rock layers, those are millions of years. You know, we look at Cambrian, 500 million years ago. And as you get closer to the surface of the earth, you get closer in time, okay, until present day. And so, so that's how that plays out. And so they argue, obviously they're reinterpreting things. So when they look at Grand Canyon, they're seeing a lot of water over a little bit of time, whereas an old earth creationist, or someone who holds to the old earth view, says that's a little bit of water through the Colorado River over a long period of time, right? And it's just the way they come to it. And someone's obviously wrong. But both, and this is the part that both are trying to use science. There's PhDs on both sides. There's many more on the older side, obviously. That's the majority view. But there are reputable young earth guys out there who have PhDs. Some of them, there's one guy from Harvard, paleontologist, who holds that into a global flood and a young earth. And so it's not that they're just saying there's no science out there. They're just trying to do science in light of their worldview, right? Yeah.
Just so you know, this isn't a smart aleck question.
Yeah.
It's an honest question. Do young earth creationists, I get it that the most of the fossil evidence they attribute back to the flood.
Yeah.
Generally, anyway. But would they believe that any of the, say, dinosaurs who were on the earth, did any of them get on Noah's Ark? Did you ever hear that talk about?
Of course. Yeah. So I've been to the Creation Museum 3 times. And I don't know where I land as far as creation.
Well, I wasn't trying to trap you.
No, I know.
You've heard.
I'm just saying. And so so I've heard the arguments over and over again. So they do believe dinosaurs were on the ark. In fact, the guy who I was just talking about, who was with me at the ROM, he looks at the Apatosaurus. It's the biggest dinosaur that the ROM has. It goes through 3 rooms. Okay, huge dinosaur. One of these, I want to say theropod dinosaurs. Is that the one? Yeah, sauropod, with the long head, long tail. Turns out, and this is how the young earth creationists argue, they say that all the animals at creation, if you read Genesis 1 and then you read Genesis 6, 7, 8, right before the flood, it's the same animals that were brought to the ark. And so they would argue, if dinosaurs were created on day 6, because they're land animals, the ones that fly technically aren't dinosaurs, like pterodactyls, the ones in the plesiosaur and these other ones that were in the water, they're not technically dinosaurs. Dinosaurs walk with their legs under their body. So all the reptiles alive, many alive today walk like this. Dinosaurs walk with their legs under their body. And so it turns out, so this guy says, how does Noah get that on the ark? And it just so happened, I don't know if this is a divine moment, but there was an Apatosaurus that was no bigger than like a Volkswagen Beetle or something. And it was like, why would he take that one? In fact, all dinosaurs start out small. Even the biggest dinosaurs out there, the Apatosaurus, the eggs, some people think, oh, it must have been the size of a bus. No, the biggest egg you can get is the size of like a watermelon. And that's just the physics of it. They breathe through the egg, so the eggs are porous. The problem is you can only make the egg so thick to hold its structure. The thicker it gets, the harder it is for the creature inside to breathe through the eggshell. And so you can only get a dinosaur egg as big as like a watermelon, okay? Or a football, really. And so every dinosaur that ever existed started out this big. So if they were on the ark, it was probably the babies. And they'd be the ones that would reproduce. Now they grew really fast. In fact, they grew their entire life. That's what we know about reptiles. They just keep growing. And so they would argue dinosaurs won the ark, and then we killed them off afterwards somehow. Just like, you know, you see a T-Rex, it's him or me. Let's take him out. So
I'd like to give you another argument as well. The first dinosaur that was named was the iguanodon, because it looked just like today's iguana. And the younger scientists would tell you that our Bibles tell us that we lived 1,000 years before the flood. And if these dinosaurs or lizards, caribou lizard is what dinosaur means, live 10 times longer, they're an animal that grows larger every year, as you've already mentioned. They would grow much larger than they do today if God also shortened their lifespan when He shortened man's lifespan.
yeah, that's a good point too. One more.
This is a great idea, but if I'm right, but if it's wrong, I heard it from somebody else.
Okay.
So, could the simple answer not be that God just created the Grand Canyon? God just created fossils?
I wouldn't argue that way, because that does seem to point to kind of this, and some people have argued that way, like Satan put, and this is how they put it, they say Satan put the fossils in the fossil record to test our faith, you know?
Or God put it in?
Yeah, or something like that. To me, this is overwhelming evidence that these were creatures that once lived. We know that you can make a fossil. In fact, you can do it yourself. You can make a fossil yourself. It really doesn't take that much time if you have the right conditions. I mean, I could put up pictures of fossilized hats and stuff. Technically, they're petrified or whatever, but you get the idea. And so it doesn't necessarily take millions of years to do that. So I wouldn't even go there. I don't know any creationist who argues that God just, bam, supernaturally said, there I want a T-Rex fossil, there I want
dead things.
The younger guys would argue, no, this is like, every time we dig up a fossil, we're seeing evidence that God judged the world. And so, yeah.
Reading through Job, it talks about Leviathan.
Yeah.
And some people...
Behemoth,
sorry, yeah. And some people think that is biblical documentation. That's animals were inhabiting the earth that aren't there at the moment.
Yeah, so that's a good point too. I mean, that's, people debate over whether Leviathan, which if you read the text, literally, it almost sounds like a fire-breathing, I don't know what you call it, dinosaur or something. In the footnote of your NIV Bible, it will say a crocodile. I don't know what that's all about, to be honest. It seems to be pointing towards something. If it's a real creature, it seems like something like a dinosaur. And then there's Behemoth. In fact, I think Leviathan and Behemoth are both rides at Wonderland now. So I don't know what's going on there. But Behemoth seems to be this giant creature. Your footnote says a hippopotamus or a elephant. But it says it moves its tail like a cedar tree. And have you ever seen the little tiny tail on the back of a hippo or the rope that's on the back of a elephant? I mean, that doesn't seem to line up when we know for a fact that there were these creatures out there. Again, I have no idea. And I don't know if anyone really does, but it does seem to point to something like that. So who knows? Yep.
I've seen pictures of explosion of Mount St. Helens.
Yeah.
Photographs, and it's amazing what happens just within that community that would be comparable to.
Yeah. So younger creationists often point to Mount St. Helens, huge eruption. At least a third, maybe 2/3 of the top of Mount St. Helens blew off. And then a number of days later, there was one of the lakes that had been blocked up, actually opened up and cut, essentially a canyon. They called like Little Grand Canyon. So we know that it can happen, essentially overnight that happened.
But they also say the Grand Canyon carved out of the water. It's at night the winds pick up the heat is absorbed from the ground and more deterioration of soil, I would say, is swept away by the winds.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I spent quite a bit of time studying that stuff, and some of it is convincing. So, I mean, that's gonna have to hold you guys, because we could be here all day talking about that subject. I mean, technically, that's not even what we were talking about. But I guess I'm gonna have to keep going on this because I still have like 30 slides to go through. So next week we will finish this off. You can bring your questions. They can have to do it the age of the Earth if you like. We can talk about radiometric dating and all that stuff. But if you want to bring your evolution questions too. All right. So you guys are dismissed.